welcome to Philoxenia, and welcome, first of all, to my guest, Anthony Barnett. Good evening.
Good evening.
It's a very big pleasure to have you tonight. I'm very sorry that we cannot sit in Vienna as we planned and discuss everything we are going to discuss. But unfortunately, COVID still keeps us on Brexit Island. I am sitting in London. You, Anthony, are sitting in Oxford.
In West Oxford, yes.
In West Oxford. Our viewers are in Vienna, but also all over the rest of Austria, Britain, maybe also in other countries. That is the big pleasure of having online talks nowadays, that the audience gets more international and bigger every day. So we can kick off our debate, maybe with a proper introduction of my guest. I'm very happy, Anthony, that this works today, because you're in the middle of just having launched a new campaign, which we will go into, which has to do with Europe and Scotland. But you also have written extensively now in the last month on what Trumpism means for America, for Europe, and for the rest of the world still. And we will discuss a little bit how this profound change of American administration politics will affect all of us. But to introduce you properly, we have to go back a little bit further in history and see, because to put it shortly, Anthony Barnett is a campaigner for democracy. For some people, maybe that seems funny, because we're living in a democratic age. At least it seems so in Britain or in Austria and the European Union. But there are weaknesses in the system that Anthony has pointed out for the past few years. You were among the first initiators of Charter 88, discussing constitutional reform of the unwritten constitution of Britain. You have also later on have been one of the founders of openDemocracy, where you still now write and influence the debate. openDemocracy is advocating democratic processes, even in countries like our countries, where we would in principle think there's a democratic system. But you are sort of guarding also the procedures, you're guarding developments that go against it. And that, of course, puts you on the forefront of the developments that we've seen in the last years. So in 2016, we first saw the vote for Brexit in Britain. Then we saw the election of Donald Trump. And all this was sort of an uncomfortable beginning of a slow undermining of democratic institutions, especially with a president like Donald Trump, ended up with a storm on the Capitol on the 6th of January, 2021. Fortunately, Trump had been not re-elected. Otherwise, we would be in quite of a different situation.
It certainly would be, yes.
So to kick off our debate, let's maybe start there with this profound change that we see now in the United States with a new administration. Joe Biden, who was not exactly known for being a radical leftist, introducing, and he was not expected to introduce radical reforms during his election campaign. It seems that he is sort of trying not to be only a transitional president in his later age, but that he's actually quite boldly attacking a few of the issues that have threatened American democracy in the last year. So what would you say, Anthony, is for you the important, profound change that Biden wants to go at now and undertake in the next month?
Well, thank you very much, Tessa. Very, very nice introduction. And it raises lots of very interesting points. But to answer your specific question at the beginning, I think that we are all involved, those of us who are Democrats, those of us who are on the left, as I am, or on the center left, with an ongoing struggle against what I call Trumpism. And Trumpism is by no means over. On the contrary, it's wounded, but it's waiting. And it exists in, I would say, argue, in the form of Erdogan in Turkey, in Putin in Russia. I would argue with Xi in China, Modi in India, and Johnson in the United Kingdom. And so I feel that this campaign which you mentioned, which you kindly mentioned, of what we call Europe for Scotland, which I want to ask all of those who are watching to sign and to support. So there's a sort of action element to this discussion. I see this as a form of resistance to Trumpism. And in America, I think it's very important to understand what is driving Biden. And I think it's a mistake to look at it in terms of his personal personalities. And I think that a lot of the media discussion is, gosh, we're surprised. Well, I'm one of those who's surprised. What is it about Biden himself? What has happened? Is this an old man in a hurry? And it's kind of all put down. There's a certain cult of the president, which of course Trump encouraged, but it goes back to Kennedy, which it sells newspapers. The media love it. It makes for sort of personal drama, but it doesn't really explain what's happening. And I think the crucial thing that happened in the United States, and which is a warning for all of us, is this. In the American election in November of last year, Biden had a popular majority of over 7 million, an overwhelming majority based on an enormous increase in voter turnout, with both the Republican side, which is a record for Trump, and on the Democratic side. But he won the election by 43,000 votes in 3 critical states, in Michigan, in Georgia, and in Arizona. And without, if Trump had won if Trump had won less than 50,000 votes more in those 3 states, he would still be president. So when you say it's surprising to campaign for democracy, it's very strange winner-takes-all democracy, which they have in the United States, and which we also unfortunately have in the United Kingdom. We don't have a proportional system as you do as there is in Germany. Sorry, I'm not. And I think you also have a proportional system in Vienna, in Austria. So, which I would regard as a modern democratic system of voting. So you've got a very narrow institutional victory, and within the Senate and we're on 50-50. We're on absolutely a knife edge, despite this enormous popular majority for the Democrats. And the Republicans now, for example, in Texas or in Georgia, where they control both the state legislature and the state executive, are pushing through reforms which are forms of voter suppression. So, for example, in Georgia, people can't offer those who are waiting in line to vote water. They're closing down balloting. There's a whole way in which they're shutting down, in particular, Black voters and ethnic minority voters, and therefore Democratic voters. So they're trying to deepen the structural lack of democracy in the United States. Now, why does this relate to what Biden is doing? Well, it's this. The great shock that the American, if you might call, liberal establishment had, and I think this includes the Bush Democrats, the Bush Republicans, the Cheney Republicans, the traditional Republicans, and the traditional Democrats, is that they beat Trump. They thought he would accept the result. He didn't accept the result. He was a bad loser. Fine. Then there was this grotesque assault upon the Capitol, attempt to use violence to reverse the presidential outcome by forcing Pence not to recognize the election. And then the shock happened. And the shock was that everybody in the Senate and everybody in the House of Representatives, all the Republicans, all knew that what Trump had done was try to use force to reverse the popular outcome. There can be no greater impeachable offense. But with the exception of about 10, they almost to a person refused to impeach him. And they did so because when they rang up their organizers, they rang up their party, they rang up their local, their base, when they talked with the machine that had elected them, this machine was almost solidly captured by Trump. So the traditional American liberal to Democrat to center Republican ruling class discovered that they'd lost the country. They'd lost the country no longer obeyed the most fundamental aspects of respecting the rule of law and of having a peaceful change of government, and that they'd lost it big time. This wasn't just 30% perhaps of the electorate, but it was a 30% of the electorate which had a lot of money and had captured the state machine in about 23 of the American states, and had captured, in effect, the Republican Party, the only alternative. So they had to do something about this. What's motivating Biden is a deep understanding of the reality of the threat of Trumpism and its capacity to return. And traditionally in the midterm elections, which is 2022, the incumbent party loses seats. And if the Democrats lose any seats, they lose Congress, and Biden is completely gridlocked. So the answer to that is they have to mobilize support. And when they came out of the financial crisis in 2008, they poured their money into the banks to save their friends in the banks. And now to come out of this political crisis, they're pouring money into the hands of working people, because without their support, without the momentum of popular support, even though they have the numbers on their side, they will not have the machine of American so-called democracy. So the drive there, which Biden is not like, oh, isn't this wonderful? This man has suddenly decided that he's sort of talking to Bernie Sanders. They know there's a very real threat, and we are all part of this. And the same goes for us in Europe, and it goes for us in particular in the United Kingdom, because the Johnson government is a Trumpian government. It's a Trumpian government in that it breaks rules, it's mendacious, it's corrupt, it's reckless, it's sexist, and it is trying to completely change the agenda. So we have an absolutely clear-cut Trumpite government, and one consequence of this, which we'll come to, is what its policy is towards Scotland, Ireland, and Wales.
Let's wait with Scotland a little bit in order to give a bit more space to the Biden plans also, because I think the big question for policymakers, as you say, is pour money into the system and try to reach those who feel that they have been left behind and have completely left also the structures of wanting to participate in classic political participation structures, like, election maybe still, but basically sort of listening to media outside of the mainstream, being among themselves, as we saw now. You described it very well in a recent article that you wrote, which maybe we can put on the screen, or have we shared it already? The End of Closed Democracy, where you describe how these stormtroops, the Trump stormtroops, where they come from actually. This young woman, 35 years old, who was serving in Afghanistan and came back and has lost completely an idea of what is sort of, possible in a political process to do, and sort of was suddenly of the opinion she can storm into the Capitol and take over, and also got killed, which is almost like a martyr type of political activism, which is quite unhelpful at the beginning of a new American administration, which is there to basically fix what happened in the last 4 years. And people did not want to accept that anymore. So the big question is, if all these trillions of dollars that Biden is now preparing to pour onto infrastructure, but also directly, you know, with this check that he sent to every household, about $1,400, which almost seems like, you know, a state handing out sort of checks to people, seems maybe for European terms slightly helpless in trying to please the public opinion. Do you think that will help at all to bring back political sort of credibility and to the system?
Well, credibility, I mean, what's very striking is that Biden's plans are popular, and that there's a very solid 30 to 35% hardline Republicans who still believe the election was stolen. But within about between 65 and 70% of the voters are saying that they like the plans, they like the infrastructure plans, they like what he's doing, and he is using that to say, my approach is bipartisan. The poor Republicans, who are the sort of stooges of Trumpism, caught in Congress, may not like it, but actually I am conducting a politics that is bipartisan, because look, Republican voters like it. They don't like his policy on immigration, but that seems to be the only one. So I think that he's got, I think he seems to be doing remarkably well. He will find it very difficult to get the full legislation through Congress, even if he can, get rid of the filibuster. But I think that the point I would make, which I think is really important, is that if he doesn't roll back voter suppression, he's quite likely to lose the midterm elections in 2022, and then there will be gridlock. So it's really important for Biden to combine, the image I have is like a DNA. There's a double helix of, on the one hand, the much needed economic reforms, the program of economic reforms of building infrastructure, of building the American economy, and of making sure that the economy works for working people. And at the same time of making sure that the most fundamental aspects of democracy, that's to say, you have a vote as you're a citizen, and they can't stop you from voting. And it's perfectly easy to vote if you're poor and you're black. It's as easy to vote as if you're a wealthy white person, with in the suburbs of Atlanta or somewhere. And that's a very serious aspect. There's no question that the Republican machine is dedicated to voter suppression, to rolling back the most fundamental aspect of democracy. And behind that is the racialization, the traditional racialization of American politics. So these people are not really Americans. So if you like, there are three prongs to what Biden is doing. One is to reboot the economy so that it works for working people. Another is to reintegrate American society finally, so that its racism, its structural racism, is reversed, which involves actions of the police and so forth. And to ensure that the most fundamental aspect of democracy, namely that citizens have the right to vote, is driven through. And there will be one or two people in the Senate who are Democrats who are holding out against that. And without 50% in the Senate, he can't get any of that through. But that, I think, is very important for us to see that domestically, these three aspects are linked.
Well, it's quite interesting also that what Biden seems to do is to pick up on the zeitgeist, which was not only the Trumpism, which in our view would be the bad zeitgeist, but he also picked up Black Lives Matter and Me Too and all these sort of society debates that have taken a lot of space outside of the classic political system already before it enters now the classic political system. by being on the streets and filling sort of social media, and people are really, really sort of engaged. You have, of course, you have AOC and other sort of younger generation politicians in the Democratic Party who are preparing the ground also for more racial equality and for a debate on historic problems that racism poses in American society. But is that something where you expect Biden to, although he's a
I think something more, I think something deeper is going on, which one way of seeing Biden is, I think it was an American commentator who said that he's always just a little bit to the left of the center of the Democratic Party. So although he's a centrist, he's a floating centrist in that, you know, if the Democratic Party is moving to the right, he will move not quite as right to the right, but just a bit. And the shift isn't personal. The shift is a deep cultural, political shift. And it's partly come from the generations inside the Democratic Party and inside Congress. But I think there's something also very important going on, which is that when the era which is now coming, we hope, at least I hope, to an end, which you could describe as a neoliberal era, which goes back to the beginning of the 1980s with Thatcher and with Reagan. And that was famously launched by Reagan with government is the problem. And it wasn't that they diminished the size of government, it's that they marketized society, and that their politics was a politics of depoliticization. It's all in the economy, it's all a matter of the market. And that the crucial moment where this became, if you like, the apparent fate of humankind was after 1989, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of Soviet communism. And then when you have Clinton followed by Blair embracing what they call globalization, embracing a neoliberal and market fundamentalist politics, which meant that they saw the state as being there to serve the market, and that this would then, quote, trickle down, or one way or another, people would benefit from this because this was the fate of the future. And this generated a very profound depoliticization, which started to explode after 2008. When, with the financial crash, you know, and we've seen there are lots of accounts of this now, of the way in which, you know, the market was the solution, government was a problem. And so all of a sudden, you know, the market completely failed and government had to rescue everybody. And in particular, started by rescuing the banks and rescuing the pillars of the market with quantitative easing. Mm. And the problem then was that they saved, if you like, the economic system, they saved that capitalist economic system by inflating asset prices. So the value of people's houses went up, the companies went up, the shares went up, but regular people's income, working people's income flatlined, dramatically flatlined. I mean, in this country, in the UK, there has never been a period of time ever since records were taken, you know, going back since what they managed to calculate from the middle of the 18th century. There's never been a decade where people's average incomes have effectively gone up so little as the one we've just been living through. So of course there's a lot of opposition that was expressed itself in Brexit, and it expressed itself in Trumpism. And I think what's peculiar about this politics is that they took neoliberalism, they took the sense of fatalism, they took the sense that the market rules, and then they politicized it. They stormed, if you like, the old elite, and they used people's anger and resentment in a manipulative fashion. But of course, what they were really doing, while Trump's language, especially in 2016, was to attack Wall Street. As soon as he got into power, he attacked Goldman Sachs brutally, and then as soon as he got into power, he got a man from Goldman Sachs, actually a Democrat, to put through the largest tax cuts for the rich that there's ever been. But he stimulated the economy, and then he was winning until COVID. And what COVID did, and it sounds odd to say that democracy has been saved by this microorganism, but what COVID did is it put a premium on government. And even if people were governing badly, if they wanted to be governed by people that were trying to govern and were not sort of just saying masks are bad and let it rip. And, and we've seen the damage that COVID has done at a terrible price to the neoliberals, to the Trumpites, to the Modis and Trump himself, and to Johnson. So we're in that very big shift. And what Biden represents is the attempt to reestablish a form of democratic government. And what that means that they have to do is they can't reverse what's happened with the politicization of the population. He was a creature, historically, Biden, of the Clinton period. And that period was marked by what you might call fatalism, by telling people there was no alternative. That was Thatcher's phrase. Whatever it was, you had to take on debt. You had to, there was no alternative. They had all the market telling you you had all this choice, but actually you didn't feel if you wanted to do something different, you had no alternative. And Blair in particular, I'll give you a very dramatic example. In 2005, Blair told the Labour Party conference, you could no more debate globalization than whether autumn follows summer. So he was just telling people, this is the way it is, that's it. And of course, this drove people out of voting. Now that's ended. And they can't go back to that.
But in a sense, then we can thank COVID that it brought out the crisis of neoliberalism.
I'm afraid so. I don't regard COVID as a friend.
No, it's very grateful. I mean,
I'm very glad that,
ironic way. Yeah.
I'm very glad that I've been, I'm double Pfizered. I mean, I'm very glad that.
So am I, by the way, double Pfizered. But let's not do any sort of vaccination envy to people who have not been vaccinated yet. We really hope that everyone gets vaccinated in the next weeks and months. But to come back to the issue of neoliberalism, which is quite interesting and which might bite, for example, also Boris Johnson in its back, is that he has actually now gotten into a situation where he has to apply social democratic politics in order to keep his voters in the red wall here in the north of England.
Yes, I don't think this is true at all. I don't really think this is true. You see, I think, and this brings us back to what's happening with Scotland. He's willing to throw money at them, but the thing I understand about someone like Johnson is that this group of people, they don't believe in government. They believe in the market. They believe in companies. This is why they're like Trump. They really hate government. They don't like rules. They don't like regulations. And he will throw money at them. But this is not what you might, even traditional social democracy. He's not trying to create a developed economy which is well governed. And that's why, he lies in parliament, he breaks rules, he brings people in, he throws them out. I mean, the sense of a disintegration of the civil service and of traditional integrity is part of the Johnson-Trump project. And can we bring this to Scotland? Because I think this is where, and this is why I would appeal to all your listeners to support us in we have to think, we as Europeans, if I may say this, I'm an English European, we have to ask, what should we ask of our European leaders with respect to what's going on in the United Kingdom? Do we just sit back and accept Brexit for what it is? Brexit was, in the end, the democratic choice of the English. Although it was quite a narrow decision, it was nonetheless driven by the English. Now, Scotland voted by 62 to 38% to remain in the EU. So a nation, a historic European nation, is being taken out of the EU against its will. And we're saying, and this is, if you could put up the Europe for Scotland on the screen.
Jutta, can you share it for us? Because Anthony, if I may just quickly interrupt you to explain what this is. This is an initiative that Anthony started together with people around the European Union, not limited to the European Union also, but in principle saying that if Scotland now goes to local elections to elect the Scottish Parliament on Thursday, the the idea of the next government in Scotland, if Nicola Sturgeon wins with the Scottish nationalists, is to try to organize a second independence votum, a referendum, an Indie Ref number 2, because the first one of 2014, the Scottish nationalists lost. And now the big question is, will Scotland go for it again under these changed circumstances? That in 2014, if Scotland would have voted for independence, it would have gone out of the United Kingdom, and with it also, for the moment at least, out of its automatic...
Excuse me, I have a landline ring. Oh, sorry.
Oh my God. So it's now on voice. It's very nice, Anrufbeantworter. We haven't had that for a long time. So to finish this thing, so it's a very crucial point in the Scottish history now on Thursday with these elections. If the majority that Nicola Sturgeon is very likely to get is big, she will put up the pressure on Boris Johnson to allow her to have another independence referendum in Scotland up to 2023. She says she does not want to do it against his wishes, against the wishes of the British government, and without permission to do so. But the question is how high the political pressure goes. So now we have a situation in Scotland where people are, after COVID, exhausted. They are exhausted from elections. They're exhausted from Brexit. Brexit didn't go so well, especially, for example, for the fishermen in Scotland in the north. So they are even more angry about this decision. But the question is, will people really go out now in full force for Scottish independence in a period of global sort of insecurity and Scottish insecurity? And that, therefore, this is the idea behind your campaign, Anthony, if I understand it correctly, is to say also that Europe is not forgetting about Scotland. And so...
Yes, I think it's a bit stronger than that, Tess. If you could scroll up down the screen. So what we're saying is, and this is what we're asking everybody to sign, but about 200 quite considerable, you know, like Elena Ferranti, intellectuals and writers and activists across the, if you could scroll a bit more, we have signed a letter addressed to the leaders of the European Union saying they mustn't regard bringing Scotland back, a country taken out of the EU against its will, in the same way, in the same process of accession, as if they're treating relatively underdeveloped countries that are seeking to rise up to European standards. Scotland has been in the European Union for 47 years. And we're saying this is a special case and it should be offered generous and immediate terms to say, please come back. And therefore, if there is a referendum, the Scots know that they will be welcomed back into the European Union, and and this is where, if you like, it links to the break from the politics of austerity and neoliberalism, is that the European Union has now raised a fund of 750 billion euros as a solidarity fund to treat COVID, to deal with the crisis of COVID. And we're saying it should be able to raise 15 or 20 billion as a solidarity fund for bringing Scotland back in. That they should, the costs of Scotland moving from being part of the United Kingdom is unprecedented. Nobody knows exactly what they are. At the moment, it isn't actually an independent government. But if the Scots wish to be such, if there's the choice should be clear to them that there's a positive way of being part of the European Union, or they can stay inside the United Kingdom. And we think that the European leaders should understand that Brexit is not a matter of a country saying, well, we just want to separate and, you know, be like Norway. Brexit is a project, and it's a Trumpian project, and its aim is to break the European Union. Its spirit is, it regards the British government regard the European Union as a cancer that will metastasize if they allow it back in. And their desire is to push sovereignty to the forefront and to break a regulated world. And that project, which is supported, of course, by Putin, it's supported by Erdogan, it's supported by the other Iron Men, is a very serious one. And we want the European Union, I think, to be able to respond to that and not say, oh, well, we must hold back it's a British issue. We mustn't interfere. It's very dangerous if there's fragmentation. No, the fragmentation and the danger is what the English are doing. And we should respond with a different language, a language of welcoming, a language of solidarity, a language of support for what is happening in Scotland. And I also think it will be very good for England. And I think England will then sort itself out, and it's a country of great courage and creativity. And we will return to the European Union alongside Scotland, Wales, and Ireland much more quickly if Scotland regains its independence in the EU than if it doesn't. So I think that so it's an argument for saying Europe must change. It's not a naive argument. It's an argument saying Europe must change. And it has to change because of the ongoing threat and challenge of Trumpism, just as in America, Biden is changing because he understands that threat there.
Well, your petition was already signed by very many, as you said, Elena Ferrante in Italy, but also Daniel Kehlmann, who in Austria counts as an Austrian author and in Germany as a German author. And
yes, exactly. And Ian McEwan here and Philip Pullman. Yep.
And Neil Gaiman. So a lot of big names have signed, and a lot will probably still do so, because it is, as you say, a call also for solidarity with a democratic movement. So now there's a bit of a debate within the European Union, because the Spanish government is always slightly scared that something like this happens, and then the Catalan movement picks up again and says, like, we also want our independence. Would you be able to explain a little bit why the Scottish quest is different in that sense?
Well, the first thing that's different is, or I will hope will be different, is that we are arguing for a legal referendum. When you said they want to ask Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon wants to ask Boris Johnson for it, the SNP, who are leading the campaign for an independent Scotland, are saying, like the one in 2014, it must be one recognized by the United Kingdom government as a legitimate referendum whose outcome will decide the fate of Scotland. And we're not asking for a wild referendum or an illegal one. And I think that it would be foolish that, because the European Union, although we want it to change, it is fundamentally a rule-based organization, and it clearly wouldn't accept a wild outcome. And I was on a discussion, I think you were on it, with the Foreign Press Association with Val McDermott, who's a very well-known Scottish writer. And she was saying, we are against the democratic deficit. We want our democracy to be recognized. We're not interested in going down a wild route. So that's one difference. The second difference is that at the moment, the United Kingdom is outside of the EU. The Catalan process is one of a wealthy part of Spain trying to break away from Spain inside the EU, and also having a much more, as I understand it, a much more profound and antagonistic relationship to the Spanish state. Whereas Scotland's been, it's different. It's a very different situation. First of all, we don't have a constitution which forbids it. And there's been a historic partnership between Scotland and England since 1707. And both countries have benefited, to the expense of the rest of the world, enormously from the British Empire. And the Scots played a very large role in that. And they are now being treated, I think it's fair to say, in a colonial fashion by the British state. And they're just saying, we want the relationship to be over. And I think that that's a divorce which everybody should be able to recognize.
I mean, the problem, of course, is I spent now my first real field trip after 1 year of lockdown.
Right.
Go to Scotland in last week and spend some time at the border. So a little bit in the north of Hadrian's Wall, where the Roman Empire, in like 2,000 years ago, built a wall, not only to keep Britannia Inferior, sort of the English lands, from being attacked by the Scots in the north, but also in order to collect money at the border in customs. So that is one of the difficult areas, I think, for this Scottish independence movement and for our solidarity with them, because one thing that we don't really like to do again in Europe is to build new walls. And that would be exactly the case. I mean, it would be a border on the British Island between England and Scotland, which sort of is the outside border of the entire European Union. And that could pose considerable.
You're not building, I don't think you should see it like that. It's not you building a wall, it's the English who are building the wall. The English have decided that there should be a wall there. The English have decided, they tried to reverse the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and the European Union quite rightly said no. You know, the single market and the customs union are, you know, without them there will be another border. The English wanted a border in Northern Ireland, and the European Union said no. You can't. If you're going to go for a hard Brexit, then you have to pull back. You can't reverse that process. And if Scotland wishes to rejoin, then the wall is England's fault. It's England's wall. It's not a Scottish wall. Scotland is not. It's not Scotland that is leaving Britain. It is England that is leaving the European Union and trying to take Scotland and Ireland and Wales with it. And if I could put it this way, in the more extreme, I know it's a rather extreme term to use, but there's a Gleichschaltung going on.
There's a what going on?
The British government is which is in a literal sense, I'm not saying it's fascist, but there was the destruction of independent institutions with a centralization into an authoritarian state. So to give you one example, which is absolutely directly relevant to Scotland, because of the very large areas of Scotland's very large land area and a small population, so it's relatively underdeveloped. So it got quite a lot of solidarity funds from the European Union. The EU, the UK as a whole was a net payer, but regional funds went very strikingly to Wales and to Scotland. The government is taking these regional funds and is no longer allowing them to go to the Scottish government. It's going to pay directly. It's going to build the bridges and stick a Union Jack on. So it's trying to close down the independent institutions, just as it's trying to destroy Parliament, and it's just trying to reverse the Human Rights Act, and it's telling the judges are the enemies of the people. It's against judicial review. It's trying to close down the independent institutions in order to keep the whole society united, as it would see it, so it can then do a deal with the United States or whoever, you know, in terms of trade, because, you know, the United States wants to do an agricultural deal with the United States, which has chlorinated chicken, and then it can't so it has to withdraw from the phytosanitary arrangements, which is what's causing a lot of the most trouble on the borders. So the big trouble, the big difficulty on the domestic border, and it would be the same with Scotland, is the movement of food.
Yeah. And
this would come about entirely because absolutely not. This is not something the English want. If there was a vote about it now in England, we wouldn't support this. We would not support chlorinated chicken, but they want to do their trade deals. So they're imposing their will. And when you say you don't want a wall, well, you know, it's not Europe's wall. It's not, and it's really important to understand this. It's really important to understand that this is not Scotland breaking away. It's Scotland returning to its natural home.
Okay, before we pick up on fascism in the English variant, I want to just make a service announcement, because we have another 15 minutes in our talk. And we would very much invite questions from the audience. Anthony would like to debate a little bit also with the Austrians. So on Facebook Live and also on our Zoom chat, please raise your hands and wave either with the yellow hands on Zoom, or write into the chat, on Facebook, and ask questions. But while you prepare your questions, let me just say that, you know, you might be right that the central British government is trying to assert its authority over the devolved nations that it's dealing with. But on the other hand, we also have to say that the both governments and the parliaments in these three nations, in Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, are having their elections now. So we are having not exactly, we Austrians are a little bit sensitive when people mention fascism, because we built it into a rather unique totalitarian system in a very short period of time. So in that sense, I think Boris Johnson is, of course, very much interested in keeping his thumb on everything that concerns the United Kingdom and not letting people go. But what we do see already now is, of course, the results of Brexit in Northern Ireland, where the First Minister, Arlene Foster, resigned last week because it became obvious that she was under pressure from within her own very right-wing party, which sees now that Brexit is not something that you can just do without having to deal with the consequences, which in the case of Northern Ireland is a new customs border in the Irish Sea. So in that
Tessa, can I just say this, because you're quite right to hold me up. There are elections taking place. There's no question about that. But if you look at the language, the intention, the project behind Downing Street. So when Downing Street, and there have been a number of cases where people in Downing Street have talked about how they're going to deal with Scotland. And their language is, do we love bomb them or do we just bomb them? There's one person was quoted as saying, we're going to, the SNP, the Scottish Nationalists, are like the Viet Cong. If your younger viewers don't know who the Viet Cong were the Vietnamese revolutionaries. And then it said, well, we're going to defeat them. We're better than the Americans. We will defeat them. This is their mentality. I mean, it's very, very violent. And the way in which they talk about Scotland is as if this, that has no right. What do we do? We've inherited this, quote, disaster of Scottish Parliament, and we've got to try and reverse and destroy it, and we've got to undermine it. And they're saying the same thing about the London mayor. The London mayor had a proportional voting system. They're now abolishing the proportional voting system in London because they can do so. They're trying to roll back the Human Rights Act. There was a Freedom of Information Act. They're trying to roll that back. So this is a government which it won't be easy for it. The institutions here are stronger than they were in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, I'm very glad to say. And you could see that Trump was doing the same thing in the United States. He was trying to push back to capture all of the different institutions and to force them to submit to a single will. And that is the Trumpian process, and that is the process that is underway in London. It may not work, I hope it won't work, but it's very dangerous, and there's no question that that is their intent.
Do we have any questions now via Facebook, maybe Jutta?
No, there are no questions on Facebook so far. So people on Facebook, please feel free to just write your questions or remarks in the comment section, and I will read them out to Tessa and Anthony. But so far, no questions on Facebook and also no questions on Zoom, as far as I can see it.
There we are.
They're all in the pub, I'm telling you, Anthony. They all went out because you can do so now in Scotland and in England. But, when we planned our talk, and we talked about the lure of greatness and the lure of smallness. The lure of greatness was the title of your most recent book in 2017, which of course dealt with the populist movements and Trump's elections and the British development. If you think about it, and as we discussed at the beginning, we already rolled over now into a new era. But one of the most interesting points is how we can get a new coalition of allies that are fighting for democracy in the wider world. So we have the rise of China, which is probably much more important to all of our futures than if Biden manages to get the electorate in the States back to the...
No, I don't think so. I think it's I mean, if I put it this way, what's happened with Brexit is tragic. It's a tragedy. It's an Anglo-British tragedy. And it came about because in a bit like Trumpism. It's been, and we can understand those causes. The image that I have for it, which if there are people listening who don't want to ask questions, I can nonetheless leave you with this image, is the way to understand Brexit is as a supernova. So when a great sun comes towards the end of its life, it emits a great pulse of energy and then collapses into a black hole. And Brexit was a great pulse of democratic energy, because it was driven by a resentment at the way we were governed and misgoverned, which was blamed on Europe, but in fact the form of misgovernment was originated in Westminster. But people were justified in saying they didn't want to go on as they were being treated, in England especially. And this lit up the political world at that moment in astonishment. And now the British state, the great star, the great sun of the British state, is collapsing into itself, into a black hole. And therefore, all kinds of negative gravitational pulls are taking place. And it's very, very sad that this is happening. And you can see the way they talk about Scotland is an example of this blackness. The way Cummings, who was Johnson's closest advisor and helped him to run the Brexit referendum, came into Downing Street, and then the way they fell out and are still fighting each other is an example of this disintegration, of this collapse. And Brexit won't work, but it will do a lot of damage. And what we're saying is, especially with the example of Biden, we don't need to accept this. Europeans do not need to. We do not need to go down this road. We can change the narrative. And it's very important when you're looking at what's happening in Britain. You don't think, Britain, historical, great country, very sound, very stable. No, this is a country going in a collapse. And in a way, the Scottish independence in the European Union would be a tremendous jolt to that process. This is the only thing that I think, can really reverse that process. I don't think it's possible for Britain on its own to do so.
Well, having said that, we have today in London the meeting of the G7 foreign ministers. So
yes.
There's Dominic Raab waltzing around. He has Blinken with him, the US foreign secretary. You have
Anthony
the German
Blinken,
foreign
yes.
They are sort of in this conversation, which has, puts the UK, the British government, in quite a good light, as it is now the G7 host, also in Cornwall in June. The question is how strong this image will also be for, internally to Scotland.
Well, it's an image, Tessa. The Scottish vote, we don't know what will happen with the Scottish vote, because the SNP have been in power for far too long. And I think that Scottish politics is locked because of the independence question. The opposition parties are not able really to breathe. And they are locked. The opposition parties are attached to traditional British parties, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the Tory Party. And because they're locked into those traditional British parties, they can't come out for independence. And so, but if we have independence, I'm quite convinced that probably a Scottish Labour Party in an independent Scotland in the European Union would almost certainly evict the SNP, certainly for a period of time. There needs to be a change of government there. So
the Green Party. The Green Party in Scotland.
Well, the Green Party following Germany, yes, it's possible. It's possible that the Scottish Greens are so associated with the SNP relationship that may not happen. But you could see, as you've had in Wales, a Green Labour alliance forming a government. But it can only happen that form of multi-party politics will only be restored in Scotland, it seems to me, after independence.
That looks like it, because Labour is not for the independence. So now we got questions.
Yes, I just wanted to interrupt you in order to let you know. There are 3 questions already. The first one is by Gertrud, and it says, why would Johnson accept the referendum? What would be his added value?
Well, the thing is, Gertrude, is this. You're quite right to ask the question, and you're quite right that his entire staff and his attitude is to refuse it. And that's why opinion in Scotland is very important, because the Brexiteers present themselves as the voice of the people. Now, we've seen recently support for independence going up to 58% in Scotland. It is still not stable. There is still not a settled majority for independence in Scotland. I'm not pretending that there is. I wish there was, but there isn't. If you get a majority, independence majority in the current parliament, and if then, in my view, Europe says, you are welcome, we're going to support you. And if then you have something like 60% of support in Scotland saying, look, we just want this Johnson figure out. You know, we're a grown-up country. We want to be part of the European Union. If you have that, it becomes extremely difficult for Johnson to retain his refusal. And he can retain it while the Labour Party says, we support you in refusing it. And then the Labour Party, desperate for doing some form of opposition, something will break. So I think that it's the last thing he wants to do, but you have to meet force with force in this case. And this is the force of democracy and the force of argument against, this shambolic, mendacious government, which is greatly lacks legitimacy. So it will be very painful for him. It isn't what he wants to do, but it's something that we will seek by every means to persuade him to agree to.
Thank you so much for your very insightful answer. I will just continue with reading the next question. It is by Susan Cohen-Unger, and it says, what can Nicola do towards independence in the EU re-entry if/when Boris blocks the desired referendum?
Well, as you said already.
Yes, I think I've answered that.
Yeah.
I think I've answered that question. It is, it's quite interesting how this reaction, which I think goes back to this long experience of fatalism that I was talking about earlier. You know, we're powerless. There's nothing we can do. You've got to accept the world as it is. And I think what's happening now, and you can see that in the United States with Biden is an example of that, is that we can put this behind us. When the euro was about to collapse, Draghi stood up and said, we're going to save the euro, whatever it takes. Right? That's not European Union policy. It wasn't. The central bank wasn't supposed to say that. But yeah, right. Okay. This is a new situation. This is what we're going to do. And I think we have to drop this sense that, there's nothing we can do. Nothing will happen. We've got to submit. I'm not saying that recklessly. I think one needs to be careful. I think you need you need to act with solidarity and with understanding, but we can be firm and we can be different, and we should feel empowered, not having to submit, as I say, to Boris Johnson's Gleichschaltung.
There's another question, Jutta. Shall we? Yes. It's by David Andreas Steinacker, and it says, should we expect attempts by the present British government to drive parts of the DUP and of Sinn Féin towards fighting one another through acts of targeted provocation, for instance?
Well, I have a sort of rule on this, which is that nobody outside Northern Ireland should talk about Northern Ireland. There's been a civil war there. Thousands of people have died. Tens of thousands of people were burnt and driven from their homes. The Good Friday Agreement was flawed in that it perpetuated the division of the two communities rather than dissolving them in a proper constitutional human rights framework. And the Protestant community, many of my friends on the left don't accept this, but I think they have very legitimate grounds for feeling threatened. And they were historically one of the great European proletariats. They were the dockers, they were the shipbuilders, they were the engineers, they built the Titanic. The English sunk the boat. The English arrogance and an iceberg sunk the Titanic. But the Protestant working class in Ulster built it. And they were, up until 1974, when they went on strike, they got rid of a power sharing agreement. It was an action a bit like Solidarity in Scotland. It had a religious element, but it was very powerful and very unified. And now East Belfast, which is the historic Protestant area of Belfast, I'm told, has the lowest educational level of any population in the European Union. So the way the British have treated Ulster is really terrible. And I think you may be right that we have a government now that is willing to cede conflict, to cede the violence there, rather than feel that it's humiliated by having to admit that there really is a border of the Irish Sea, which is what it's agreed to. But I won't say anything about what I think should be done. The last thing that the province needs is outsiders poking their finger in.
Well, it's a very tense situation, of course, now also not having a government is sort of only one of the many consequences that we have now from Brexit. And that was irresponsible enough of the British government to let it come to that. Yeah. But
it's a sign that the British government itself, the thing of the black hole, is caught in this Brexit process. It's got to try and bring everybody with it, you know, and then it can't. And so these conflicts will be occurring. We'll see the same thing we'll see the same thing in London. We'll see the same thing in its relationship to race.
Well, one of the stories which is so far completely underreported is also that in Wales, independence is gaining more cloud now, yes. And we're starting to discuss. So I think, Anthony, now we will stop our talk about the lure of greatness and smallness for today. But I think we are having like a series of talks in our backhand here in the next coming months and years, because I think the story is by far not over. I want to thank you very, very much for coming on today. And pleasure. I also will share now, and we should all share maybe on social media and our websites, on the Bruno Kreisky Forum website, the Europe for Scotland initiative, which is something people can sign if they want to show that Europe is open for Scotland, which I think could be very, very helpful for not only for election day on Thursday, but also in the next weeks to come, months probably, and even years.
I want to sign and show your support. I'd really appreciate that.
That's great. Also, can I say thank you to Gertrud Auer, the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue, to Jutta, our tech queen in Vienna, and to all our listeners on Zoom and on Facebook Live. A little bit of a service announcement is my next Philoxenia talk is on May 12th with the American professor Christine Gotzi from the University of Pennsylvania, and we will discuss her latest book, which is called Why Women in Socialism Have Better Sex. On that happy note, I will leave you all tonight. And I hope to see you next week. And you, Anthony, I hope we can go for a walk somewhere in Oxford and discuss what comes out of your initiative in the next.
Very good. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.